No.
Hi everyone, welcome back to our QualLab lunch series for spring semester. My name is Ruth Liu. I use she, her, hers pronoun, and I am the co-facilitator of today's lunch talk. Today's lunch talk is a joint effort from team members from all the QualLab team, as indicated in our banner in the slide. So I will introduce each one of our members, and please be sure to wave to the camera so we know who you are. Faustina Mencha, doctoral student intern extraordinaire from Ohio University. She's interested in student retention, success for marginalized populations. Faustina will also be facilitating our chats, directing questions during Q&A session, and sharing resources from QualLab. Tessa Smith, PhD student in the Philosophy and History of Education program. Her current research interests include the ethics of censorship and the role of education in addressing and normalizing death, mortality, and grief. Tessa will be facilitating our slides, and she has been actively involved in the planning process of this talk. Kelsey Gilbert, PhD student in HESA, and she is interested in critical approaches to trauma and trauma-informed practices in higher education settings. Kelsey oversees different projects in the QualLab, and she provides trainings for all of us. She is very knowledgeable about qualitative research and has a lot of patience for our new GRAs. Dr. Radisha McMillan, who may not be here with us today, but she is an assistant professor of educational policy, and she is also a nationally certified school psychologist. She supports QualLab's consultation in M Vivo. Last but not least, our director, Dr. Penny Pasquay, who needs no introduction. She is a professor of educational studies here at The Ohio State University, as well as director of the QualLab and qualitative methods in the Office of Research, Innovation, and Collaboration. She is editor of one of the leading research journals in the field, the Review of Higher Education. And her research focuses on complexities in qualitative inquiry, inequities in higher education, and disconnections between higher education and society. We're very lucky to have Dr. Pasquay's guidance in the QualLab. I want to first acknowledge that we're on the indigenous land of the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Wyandot nations. And we have a full agenda today. Dr. Pasquay will first extend her welcome and help us clarify some housekeeping items for today's talk. Then I will have the honor and pleasure to introduce today's wonderful speakers, Dr. Susan Iverson and Dr. Elizabeth Allan. Both of them will give us a thought-provoking talk on policy discourse analysis from feminist poststructural perspectives. After their talk, we will allow 10 to 15 minutes for questions from all of you, and our colleagues, Faustina and Chelsea, will help us facilitate the process. At the end of the session, we will share some information on how to get involved. So without further ado, let's welcome our director, Dr. Penny Pasquay, to share her word of welcome.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to kick off the 2022 QualLab series, and also, as you heard already, welcome some fantastic new grad students and interns to our team. So it's been tremendous to work with them. And I'm also happy to, I know you'll be introduced to Dr. Iverson and Allan, who have participated in QualLab lunches in the past. So now they're on the presenter side, which is exciting to see. So housekeeping, keep your videos on if you can. We understand you're eating lunch, it's casual, etc. Microphones are off right now. You can turn your microphone on during Q&A, so please, it's casual. Feel free to go ahead and do that. If you don't want to, always feel free to write your questions in the chat, and Ruth and Fosti will facilitate those. And we are recorded, so of course, if you need any closed caption, just let us know ahead of time. We can always provide that. But I should say a lot of events for the QualLab, our series this year, are up on our website, and we're adding to it regularly with the new teams. So those will, we have April scheduled with Dr. Nicolazzo, but we have some others that are in the works right now. So please go to our websites and check out the wealth of information that we have there for you. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to Ruth.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Pasquet. Now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers today. Dr. Susan Iverson is a professor of higher education leadership and director of the doctoral program in educational leadership at Manhattanville College. Dr. Iverson's research interests focus on equity and diversity, status of women in higher education, scholarship of teaching and learning, and the role of policy, for example, sexual violence in shaping problems representations. In addition to more than 30 articles and 25 chapters, she has 2 co-edited volumes, Feminist Community Engagement, Achieving Praxis, and Reconstructing Policy Analysis in Higher Education, Feminist Poststructural Perspectives. Iverson worked in student affairs administration for nearly 15 years prior to becoming faculty. She earned her doctorate in higher education leadership with a concentration in women's studies from the University of Maine. Welcome, Dr. Iverson. Dr. Elizabeth Allan, she, her, is professor of higher education at the University of Maine, College of Education and Human Development. Her research focuses on campus culture, climate, equity, and inclusion. She is the author of Policy Discourses, Gender and Education, Women's Status in Higher Education, Equity Matters, and co-editor of Reconstructing Policy in Higher Education, Feminist Poststructural Perspectives. Dr. Allan has authored or co-authored more than 40 research-based articles and book chapters. Her application of critical and post-structural discourse perspectives to policy is the focus of her 2003 article in the Harvard Educational Review, which was awarded the Outstanding Publication Award by the American Educational Research Association's Division J. Her scholarship has also appeared in the Journal of Higher Education, the Review of Higher Education, Innovative Higher Education, and the Journal of Student Affairs, Research and Practice. Welcome, Dr. Allan. Drs. Iverson and Allan, thank you so much for being here with us today. We will now turn to you and give us a lunch feast on your discussion on post-structural feminist policy and qualitative perspectives. So
thank you.
Thank you.
So
if you don't mind sharing your screen,
yeah,
and we can.
Turning to that now. Was I successful? Good.
Looks great.
Good. I'm out of here. That's what I was here to do. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth, for that introduction, and Penny for the invitation for Dr. Allan and I to speak on this. We really appreciate the OSU QualLab's series overall, and it's an honor for us to be a part of that. So we're going to go through a series of sort of undergirding the methodology and some applications of it and some things to think about, and are aware to leave some time at the end for us to discuss. So, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you, Susan, and thanks everyone. Thanks QualLab team for inviting us here today. It's an honor. And we are going to begin our comments with our land acknowledgements. And so I'll begin with the University of Maine's acknowledgement, which recognizes that the University of Maine is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination.
And I'm going to share for Manhattanville College our land acknowledgement located in Purchase, New York. And you'll see this excerpt that our archivist identified that is somewhat debated, but connects the name of Purchase to the Swanoy Indians, but recognizes that we reside on the original and ancestral tribal lands of the Munsee, Lenape, and the Wappinger tribes, and remain committed to not just acknowledging that historical ancestral space, but also the place and space. How do we continue to acknowledge, recognize, educate ourselves about what that history and contemporary reality means? So with that, what we also want to move to is a little bit about situating ourselves. So you have a sense. Well, it was a wonderful introduction that Ruth provided. We want to give you a little bit more context of sort of our history and legacy so that you know kind of where we are situated. Well, I could list the words of titles, and you heard that in the introduction. This is a collage that gives you a little sense of sort of my constructed and constituted self. Well, I can tell you I was born in New Jersey and grew up in Maine, and have moved around New England. I was in Maine, raised on a dairy farm, and agriculture, land, animals, but also labor have been very foundational to my sense of identity. My mother, a school teacher, and my father, a truck driver before he became a dairy farmer, were both in unionized professions. And so I think my original thinking critically arises out of that labor and land roots. And it really wasn't until under Dr. Allan's mentorship and guiding me towards feminist classes that I acquired language for what I had embodied prior to that in my career, thinking about inequities along class lines, racial lines, gender lines, and many other dimensions of identity. And also extending some of that thinking to care about lands, environment, and spaces that we're in. Also, my identity as an academic mother is very central. The picture that you see at the bottom there is my daughter in her weeks old on a pillow as I was working on my dissertation. And now she's a sophomore in college with our dog. So I hope that this gives you a sense of not just positions that I hold and who I am, but also what has informed and constructed my sense of self and the way that I think about practice and scholarship and pedagogy.
All right. And now for my collage. Inspired by Susan's collage. In terms of situating myself as a researcher, I'll begin by how I identify as a white, middle-class, able-bodied, cisgendered woman. Don't necessarily identify as straight, but have been happily married to a man for 26 years, so I pass. and experience that identity privilege. While my family growing up was middle class, socioeconomically, my parents were from working class backgrounds. And so my socialization was a mix of working class and rural perspectives, as well as college educated parents. My mom was a school teacher, very strong values of education. And my dad was a pilot in the Air Force. And so I was born in Texas and lived in California, North Dakota, but grew up mostly in New England. Some other things about me that are relevant. I now live in rural Maine. That's me, whitewater canoe racing. I enjoy outdoor activities and value the land and work to honor it as well as I enjoy it. Being a mother is very much a part of my identity. I dug out these photos. On the left, you see a picture of my partner and 2 children at my dissertation defense in Ramsayre Hall at Ohio State University. So it's kind of fun to think about being here and for this QualLab and coming full circle from that moment, because my dissertation was focused on using feminist post-structural perspectives for policy analysis. I consider myself a scholar activist. You can see there pictures of photographs of me with my daughters at the Women's March, Black Lives Matter marches. I engage at the grassroots, but I also, am very committed to research, to practice and activism and change making. Prior to earning my doctorate, I was involved with campus sexual violence prevention, anti-racist work, and initiatives to promote more inclusive and safe campus experiences for students. I worked for 5 years as a campus-based professional in student affairs roles, and was drawn to pursuing my PhD because I was increasingly aware of the complexities of social change and frustrated by the glacial pace at which it seemed the change was occurring. So I wanted to do more. I wanted to have more formal power. That was my initial interest in gaining the credential. But at the same time, I really wanted to have more frameworks for understanding these, to try to understand and unravel some of these complex questions that I was facing related to, that we were all facing related to equity and social justice. So I was hoping to get more clarity. So I began my journey, my doctoral work, and completed it at The Ohio State University. One last photograph in the center there reflects my commitment to formal policy and policy analysis. That is me a few years ago at the US Senate Help Committee, where I was able to provide some testimony based on my research. So another way in which I work to apply my research to practice in a policy arena. All right, next slide, please.
I'm going to skip to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to just continue on with some comments around sort of the theoretical traditions and lineage that undergird, as Susan alluded to. We're going to spend some time talking about these traditions that undergird our approaches to policy analysis using feminist post-structural perspectives. In brief, I came to my understandings of feminist post-structuralism through my doctoral studies at Ohio State. I had many wonderful professors and learning experiences, and was strongly influenced by strong feminist scholars. I had the privilege to work with many of them while at Ohio State. My committee chair, Dr. Marianne Danowitz, was a scholar of women and gender in higher education. She studied leadership and governance and organizational change, and provided me with many opportunities to learn about these topics and broaden my horizons even further by encouraging me to take a course in feminist theory with Dr. Mary Margaret Fenneau, who was a professor of women's and gender studies at the time, and thankfully gave me permission to enroll in her feminist theory course, and then to continue working with her by teaching. It was called women's studies at the time, but now women's and gender studies. Not hyperbole to say this was life-changing for me. And at the same time, I was taking qualitative research courses with Dr. Patty Lather, and oh my goodness, mind-blowing experience. All of these opportunities were coming together to shift my world, opening up completely new ways of thinking about how we come to know, what counts as research, what counts as knowledge, what counts as truth, what assumptions are embedded in different inquiry paradigms and the implications of that for our daily lives. So building on that foundation, I took a history of women in education and history of modern education with Dr. Mary Leach, where we read Foucault's Discipline and Punish. And my mind was spinning and knew I needed more. So that summer, I had the incredible gift of taking a womanist theory course with Dr. Valerie Lee, another brilliant scholar in English literature, Black studies, and folklore. In that course, we took a deeper dive into the writings of Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and others. It was just an incredible opportunity looking back on it now. And then I was introduced to Dr. Nancy Campbell, who joined the faculty in women's and gender studies, and had the privilege of learning from her. Her PhD was in the history of consciousness, and she studies the ways, looks at historical ways in which drugs use, drug policy, thinking about addiction, conceptualizations of that have been produced by dominant discourses. That's an oversimplification, but essentially my brain was on fire, and in a good way. It was a very challenging time for me intellectually, and also very empowering. And all these intersections and points of overlap and synergies and points of rupture and destabilization, I'll just be always so very grateful for it. And as Dr. Lather would say, it was a very dizzying time, but also a very productive time. And as I said, an empowering time too. So let's zoom out a minute, if we could, to the next slide. And
next one, or?
No, this one.
Okay.
So this slide is actually the title of one of my dissertation chapters. And I just want to take a couple minutes to explain how I got to this, this title for a dissertation chapter, which I was very appreciative of my committee and Dr. Lather, especially for supporting me in being able to do this work. So my research interest was grounded, for my dissertation, was grounded in lived experience as a woman working in higher education. Prior to my doctoral work, I had been asked to serve on a university women's commission. That was in the early 1990s. And that was at another university, not at Ohio State. And these women's commissions, many still exist, but they were modeled after a UN Commission on the Status of Women in 1946. And then later in 1961 at the federal level, President Kennedy commissioned a commission on the status of women, and through an executive order. And then slowly these commissions began to take formation on college campuses throughout the country. When I came to Ohio State, I met other women who had served on commissions, and my advisor, Dr. Danowitz, was very familiar with this strategy at multiple campuses throughout the US. So when I had a chance to take a closer look at their reports, I realized they had been produced for decades, beginning in the 70s and the 80s. And here it was the 90s, the mid to late 90s. And as I was reading these reports, I realized, and these are policy-related reports. They're identifying the problems related to gender equity and providing recommendations for solutions. And what I saw was that the reports produced in the 90s were often saying the same things that were said in the 80s and the 70s. And so I just, sort of building on the foundation of my coursework, kept having all these questions around why are the problems framed in this way? Are these kinds of approaches effective? Could they be more effective? And so forth. So when I decided to study this topic for my dissertation, I went to policy analysis as a method, and I just felt that the approaches fell short for what I wanted to do. I was drawn to post-structuralism for the tools it provided to illuminate take it for granted assumptions, dominant discourses and how they construct subject positions. But I was also committed to being a critical scholar, to change making, to making a positive difference and advancing social justice and equity. So at that point, I was fortunate enough to stumble upon or to find work by Dr. John Sawicki, who's now a professor at Williams College, a philosophy professor. Also Sarah Mills, Chris Whedon, who wrote about feminist poststructuralism. And through their work, I saw a path. I saw a path for how post-structural tools like discourse analysis could be part of a critical approach to policy analysis. And I was also inspired by the work of Dr. Wanda Pillow and Dr. Elizabeth St. Pierre, who were advanced doctoral students in the program at Ohio State and were pursuing similar interests, scholarship interests. All right, we can move to the next slide, thanks. So fast forward a decade, here we see the cover of my 2008 book, which was based on my dissertation. And what's depicted on the right is a table from that book, which explains the inquiry frames that shaped policy discourse analysis as a methodological approach. And this was very much grounded in Dr. Lather's work in her book, Getting Smart, where she described the goals and different assumptions embedded in various inquiry paradigms. And so I ultimately came to take a similar kind of approach to highlighting the inquiry frames that informed a methodology, that desperately sought methodology, which became policy discourse analysis. And so you see here the interpretive and the critical and the post-structural influences that merge together to create this hybrid approach to policy analysis. All right, now we're going to just take a minute to define terms so that we're on common ground in terms of where we're coming from with particular concepts like discourse. In using this approach with policy analysis, we're looking at discourses as not just words on paper, not just a reflection of a reality, but a dynamic constellations of words and images that produce. So they not only reflect, but they also produce or contribute to producing a given reality. And then dominant discourses are those discourses that are so normative, so dominant that they eclipse other ways of making sense of things. Then the concept of power knowledge is really important to the approach in that this understanding of power in discourse to produce reality and to produce subject positions that we then take up or occupy as part of our own identities. And then conventional policy studies tends to take a rational scientific approach and emphasize value neutrality in policy analysis, and tended to gloss over assumptions that were embedded in the articulation of policy. And Deborah Stone's work was really path-breaking in illuminating how values play into policy and policy analysis. And so her work and the work of a number of other feminist scholars informed this approach to policy discourse analysis that applies feminist, critical, and post-structural perspectives in a hybrid approach to the analysis of policy. All right.
I'll pick up the baton from here. So what I'm going to do is, well, Elizabeth and I both are just going to provide sort of a cross section of some examples of what then does this look like. And we had a hard time winnowing and choosing. And so we wanted you to just see, this is a snapshot of some of the many ones that have applied PDA. There's a lot of work out there that's critical discourse analysis, others that adopt post-structural, feminist, and critical approaches, but may not be Allan's policy discourse analysis method. So what we wanted to highlight were some of those that have applied this method. And there are others, but we wanted to see the ways that individuals are using it. I'm going to start with talking just a little bit about my own dissertation research. And hopefully what you're also hearing when Dr. Allan said that this is rooted within her own lived experience, and part of that feminist piece coupled into the post-structural is that way that grounds what we're doing as emancipatory, as change-oriented, because post-structuralism could just be destabilizing, but you may not then have a place to land your foot and take some action off of that. So the coupling of these and how that is born out of our own experience as we were living these things. So my dissertation research was a policy discourse analysis of diversity action plans at land-grant universities. And my sort of way that pieces were woven together, one, Elizabeth did a lunch and learn at the University of Maine, and I have had a career of doing policy work in higher education, most directly related to sexual violence policies. And had thought about studying sexual violence policies, but didn't exactly know how. And it was hearing her speak at that lunch and learn that I just then had this, wow, there is the way that I can look at what are the embedded assumptions, what's being taken for granted. Why is this perennial problem of, at that time, violence on campus? But that was when I was first starting. I was then getting into my feminist theory and feminist methodology classes that, similar to her story, really started to give me a broader theoretical, ontological destabilizing of how I was thinking about my work. And it was a moment with Sharon Barker, who at the time was the director of the Women's Center, because there was one of these commissions on women that the college president had convened. And she sarcastically said, yeah, just tear the front page off of another one and put on the new year. And there you go, because nothing ever changes in them. And so thinking about sexual violence policy, having heard about policy discourse analysis, thinking about her words, and having work going on related to diversity action plans, I selected those policy documents to analyze and reveal what are the policy discourses and what are the subject positions that we take up then. Consistent with some of Allan's finding of Women's Commission reports was this discourse of access and these strands that produce diverse individuals. And I recognize all the limitations of that language and its use as sort of a placeholder subjectively as an outsider to this institutional insider status. And alongside that, this discourse of disadvantage that was producing then at-risk victims that were both reliant on the institution that was the source of the discrimination as being sort of the ombuds to then resolve. And alongside that was also this marketplace discourse that commodifies diversity as a tool for reputational gain for the institution. And then a little less visible was this discourse of democracy that situates change agents, but the larger pull of the marketplace discourse really situates those change agents as entrepreneurs, right? Grant money, resources, innovation that's in the service of institutional excellence. So that gives you a sense of sort of how I came into this with these policies, and we're going to feature some others that have looked at this as well. Gildersleeve and Hernandez looked at policies related to undocumented students, state policies in particular, and the particular identities that were labeled or named fell in these 5 categories of alien, individual, minor, person, and student. And this alien subject position emerged more dominantly. And so they used this approach to deconstruct that and illuminate the ways that this was a dehumanizing discourse and situates who has legitimacy and the ways that immigrant bodies are politicized. And I think, Elizabeth, you're going to talk about Helen, and then Dirk, I will turn to you.
Yes. All right. So briefly, this is Dr. Lisa Hallen's work. And she studied, she used policy discourse analysis to study high school curriculum guides in public high schools across the country. She looked at guides in each of the 50 states. And her findings illuminated how particular subject positions for students were shaped and reinscribed in these policy-related documents. These documents, she concluded, constructed student identities that included techniques of surveillance and that were often taken for granted and unchallenged, a dominant discourse of science classified students in ways that were, because this is like tracking was no longer happening, formal tracking in courses, but it was still happening is what she was finding, but it was being called high achieving or classes for students who were considered low achieving or underachieving. And there was permissions that were required for these students if they wanted to take the course, sometimes parental permission. So there was a way in which these curriculum guides were producing docile bodies of students and reinscribing certain subject positions that positioned the school as knowing best about what would work for them in terms of their achievement, their academic achievement and choice.
And then you want to quickly tell a little bit about Dirk's approach with this?
Sure. So also D.A. Dirks used policy discourse analysis. This study was published in the Review of Higher Education in 2016, looking at policy-related documents at 4 Big Ten campuses, finding dominant discourses of vulnerability, constructed subject positions of victim and fearful individuals, a disability discourse constructed a disordered subject, and a resourceful discourse constructed the change agent subject position.
Great. I always think that it's very exciting when students, and Elizabeth has had several, including me, and I have had a few that take up these approaches. And most recently, a student of mine at Manhattanville, Nicole Mangier-Nover, adopted the PDA approach to look at collective bargaining agreements in K-12 schools and what they construct for realities for teachers and how they set forth the teacher as a professional and the teacher as a laborer, but then this intersection of them being this managed manager. The excitement in some of this is the lineage when you think sort of ancestry tied to Patty Lather through Elizabeth Allan, and then to have others that carry this forward, certainly exciting. And then I mentioned that I had thought about sexual violence policies as a doctoral student, post-deposited my dissertation, I did come back to this and have done some work looking at sexual violence policies and some of the New York expectations around here, and the way that there's a production of risk that situates victims as always already vulnerable, a dependence that has that similar paradox of being reliant upon the institution that is the site of where they were not kept safe. The reasonable person, which is a concept out of law, and the way that that can be gender neutral and identity neutral when it is endowed and embodies dimensions of identity. And then sort of also this subjectivity related to the misconduct overall. So in a little slice of our time, I want to just say, like, what might we then think about this going forward? One, that policy is never neutral. It is something pinging that I don't know how to stop. So my apologies if you're hearing a bing in the background. But and this is to Elizabeth's definition of terms that shift from the rationalist position of policy that does not ask questions and suggests that policy is neutral, where the feminist poststructural PDA approach is intentionally interrogating what might be operating, what is operating within these policy documents. And the individuals, most of the time, that are serving on these policy committees are deeply committed to policy being a vehicle for change. Elizabeth and I have both identified our own sort of paradoxical relationship with both interrogating and troubling policy at the same time that we're showing up in places to produce policy. So how might policy then unwittingly reproduce the problem that it seeks to redress? And so what this approach both makes visible, but then invites, is for us to trouble these concepts like excellence, which is so, Reddings has a book that really interrogates some of the way that excellence is taken up from universities to McDonald's, right? Everything, parking is excellent. And we need to trouble that and illuminate the ways that whiteness and other things are carried in notions like authenticity and excellence. Why not lean into inefficiencies? Because the liminality of the space that can be available for us to reflect and maybe complicate and do things differently if we were inefficient for a little while. And dominant discourses like safety and professionalism that make it hard for us to think of alternative ways of being and doing. So this approach invites those opportunities. And also the reflexivity around not only the power dynamics that are embedded, but also those who are the policy authors and participating in the process. And the ways that context matters. I was particularly struck with looking at these mandates at the state level for things like sexual violence policy, that then policies tend to, and New York State did this, issue templates. And so what then is undermined, that if one template is going to cut across all institutional types and standardize and institutionalize particular vocabularies, that then erases the realities of that context and the individuals who we intend to serve with those policies. So there's some questions that you can bring forward to even invite some of that initial thinking about problematizing what's embedded, looking at what has been produced, what has given rise to the particular issue. Often the solutions within policy are actually not corresponding with the problem. They're often corresponding with a symptom of it. If you think about interpersonal violence, often the solutions are ombuds, whistles, training. None of that is addressing the root cause of sexual violence on campus. It's assuming it always already exists. and we need to be equipped to respond to this reality that will be there. So in addition to these, we invite any of your questions, but certainly some of the types of things, how do you identify these? How do you have a sense of subject positions within policy? What else does these tools sort of invite for thinking about addressing policy? And while we're going to engage discussion now, we also invite you to follow up with us, and we're happy to share a copy of this PowerPoint with anyone who may want that. So, and it includes references as well at the end. So I will stop share, and thank you again for your time and listening, and welcome questions or dialogue. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Drs. Iverson and Dr. Allan. Policy is never neutral, and we need to think beyond the current structures and policies and think deeper in our work as well. So thank you so much. We are now opening the floor for all of our audiences. Just let me know if you have any questions. You can, I think because we're just a intimate group today, you can feel free to unmute yourself. Yes, I think right now I will need to unspotlight you and
I've got a question.
spotlight for everyone. Okay, can everyone see the gallery view now?
I'm looking at a screen share right now, but maybe I'm only seeing it. There we go.
I've got a question.
Yes, Dr. Lather, thank you.
Very good to see you, Elizabeth. That was like a walk down memory lane.
I know. It's great to see you.
Names I haven't heard for a long time. But yes, all brought together in your program, as I remember. So happy days. Interesting to see how your work is circulating and showing up in other people's work. And I was intrigued with the slide on how to, in a way, go against the tendencies to not pay attention to the problem of the problem. But I was particularly, I had a question around the, what does it mean to foster inauthenticity? And just as a way of prefacing that, I've got a lot of problems with authenticity myself. Claims to authenticity, the real of this or that. And you see it everywhere now, especially in advertising. How to be your authentic self, whatever that is. So when you say, what would it mean to do a kind of policy analysis that actually fostered in authenticity or troubles authenticity, what would that look like?
I mean, I'll venture initially, but then Elizabeth, please add in as well. I think the first step is the interrogation before you can get to the fostering, because in my application of this approach, it's first valuable to make visible what are the root problems, what is represented in what's being conveyed through policy, and making visible not just the dominant discourses and the subjectivities that are produced. And what you're raising is that what we're increasingly being called to notice in this authentic self, authentic leader, is the way that that is carrying a racialized, gendered, whiteness assumptions within it. So there is a particular performance of the subject, the leader, whoever it may be, that does not permit everyone to be authentic, and that the performance of authenticity has to conform within a particular parameters. So I think the first step has to be an interrogation of that and illuminating. Then to the extent that some alternative discourses give rise to, so that it's not me imposing, but what is visible within these texts. But when I think of the inauthenticity, it is to actively problematize what's embedded within authenticity, so that then we can say, what does it look like to be loud or disruptive, and who's actually allowed to get angry in a meeting, right? And so then we can have, that's the dissonance and the discomfort, that how do we then turn to the troubling conversation to hold space for the moments that are going to make me as a white woman feel uncomfortable at my blind spots of professing authenticity that's going to leave others marginalized, code switching, uncomfortable in a space. So I don't know, but that's off the top of my
That's
head.
very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. There's a whole literature on the critique of authenticity that is very intriguing. And so this is an interesting example of putting it to work in policy analysis. Good for you.
Thank you, Dr. Leather, for your great question. So we, in mindful of the time, we will allow another question. So Sharon shared that I saw Dorothy Smith and IE in the book slide and was wondering how IE intersects with PDA.
So yeah, Dorothy Smith's work intersects, conceptually, it's not like a specific strategy as far as the methodology, but the uncovering of assumptions, the general approach from a sociological vantage point was very influential for me in thinking about how to take a different kind of approach to policy analysis. And just to add to what Dr. Iverson was saying earlier is that, and thank you for the question, Patty. I think, that is something for feminist post-structural approaches to policy can feel dangerous, just as critical theoretical approaches do, and because often we're asking questions. For example, I was asking questions to destabilize notions of equity, because we're all coming to the table taking for granted that was something good, that was something we all wanted to strive for. But what were the assumptions embedded in it? Who was defining what equity was, what that looked like, and for whom? So it's a similar kind of, and I think that's where we have to go in order to open up space for different ways of thinking.
Yeah, I can give a quick follow-up example to that sort of dangerous notion, both in talking about the diversity work and sexual violence work at conferences or in other places. Both deep advocates of the work, or in both those arenas, would question, I'll give an example out of sexual violence work, when I problematize the construction of the victim and how often in policies this ungendering can situate masculinity as still having agency and femininity as having vulnerability. What then for our interventions of doing prevention work are the implications of that, right? Like, who's going to feel kind of entitled to come to the front of the line at the march, and who really feels a voice? And when I would say, like, how do we try to flip some of these scripts, thinking about like orientation programs that do training, then I would have individuals that say, well, you can't then suggest that someone is going to defend or fight or argue. There's increased risk in that regard. But then I feel like we are participating with the dominant discourses that are framing the problem. And I don't want to be naive to those realities, but how do we step into those dangerous spaces to say, what is that really going to look like if we want to ultimately address the root problems?
So I know I'm watching Ruth and time and all that and want to be respectful, but I also wanted to just reflect on some of the students that are here are venturing into post-structural work and are commenting with me about, hey, you know, this was going on in the 90s. Wait a minute, there's this wealth of research and literature and information, and the importance that you're talking about taking the scholarship to practice and where it is enacted or silenced and all that. Do you have advice for students other than Evan mentioned in your course this summer to be taking, but other thoughts about how they might approach really diving in to capture some of the work that's the historical, but also to push on post-structural today in terms of thinking about where it should head?
Well, I don't know if you have a quick thought about Elizabeth. I mean, one is for all students research, it's reading, 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 right? And I have a few students on here, and we had our advanced qual class, and you know, there's always the frustration of how do I find my theory? How do I find sort of conceptually where I'm situated? And it takes a lot of reading, reading, reading to really ground. And I think that's what's so beautiful about, and Elizabeth knows I refer often to that chapter title of Desperately Seeking Methodology, because while she constructed this methodology, all of us really need to go through that desperately seeking. I think every researcher, but particularly when you're in that more novice place of embarking upon this as a doctoral student, how do you find what's really going to fit? And so it is an inefficient process, right? And we're looking for like, what, tell me the path, how do I get there? And so you have to read some of this stuff and figure out what resonates and why. So that's where the reflexive piece, why does this seem, and how do I read maybe some counter stuff, additional stuff to figure out what are the questions. And that's why I give the example of going to Elizabeth's Lunch and Learn, because that moment I realized there's certain types of questions that I'm asking that this is an approach that aligns with how to investigate what I'm looking to explore. So I don't know if you have another thought, Elizabeth, or I know we're winding on time here.
That was great. I agree.
Thank you so much. We're quickly approaching at the end of our hour, but please don't forget to contact us if you have more questions or interest to book a consultation hour with us. And we want to thank you again for our wonderful, wonderful speakers for such a treat today. We wish all of you best of luck in your qualitative research, and we hope that you will check out our future events. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.